Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we're in your hymnals now on page 1076. We reach now the story that Odysseus is relating to Alcyoneus, the king of the Phaeacians, the cattle of the sun god. Okay? Now, let's say three things quickly for your notes to set this passage up. One, this is the end story of the adventures of Odysseus, because it will be after this story that he ends up getting jacked on the island of Calypso. Okay? In other words, this is where he loses all of his men. Number two, think about the ways that the Odyssey is a series of stories in this flashback mode, right? That the Odyssey is a series of flashback stories that basically suggest you have to be careful about distractions, right? The goal is to get home to Ithaca. Yes, all of Odysseus and all his men, they want to get home. But along the way, they have all of these distractions, these, can we say it now, temptations, right? The story of the cattle of the sun god is the penultimate temptation. Number three, imagine for a moment, would this turn us all into vegetarians or what? If you went and got your Big Mac, and right before you got ready to eat it, the meat started wiggling and then mooing. Right? I think for most of us at that point, we would probably decide, no more Big Macs, maybe no more meat of any kind, right? I mean, that's just the nature of it. And so we're working now with a story where we're going to have that kind of project happening, okay? So let's go ahead now, get ready to turn to this passage, the cattle of the sun god, and let's ask ourselves to enjoin this notion of the temptation, the disobedience of his, remember we saw this earlier, his soldiers don't want to listen to him all the time, yes? And of course, in the end, this is going to lead to a serious problem, namely their deaths, all right? So here we go, we're ready now to follow along, just follow along, and then we'll come back to do our annotated work.
The cattle of the sun god. In the small hours of the third watch, when stars that shone out in the first dusk of evening had gone down to their setting, a giant wind blew from heaven, and clouds driven by Zeus shrouded land and sea in a night of storm. So, just as dawn with fingertips of rose touched the windy world, we dragged our ship to cover in a grotto, a sea cave where nymphs had chairs of rock and sanded floors. I mustered all the crew and said, "Old shipmates, our stores are in the ship's hold, food and drink. The cattle here are not for our provision, or we pay dearly for it. Fierce the god is who cherishes these heifers and these sheep, Helios, and no man avoids his eye." To this my fighters nodded, yes. But now we had a month of onshore gales, blowing day in, day out, south winds or south by east. As long as bread and good red wine remained to keep the men up and appease their craving, they would not touch the cattle. But in the end, when all the barley in the ship was gone, hunger drove them to scour the wild shore with angling hooks for fishes and seafowl, whatever fell into their hands, and lean days wore their bellies thin. The storms continued. So one day I withdrew to the interior to pray the gods in solitude for hope that one might show me some way of salvation. Slipping away, I struck across the island to a sheltered spot out of the driving gale. I washed my hands there and made supplication to the gods who own Olympus, all the gods. But they, for answer, only closed my eyes under slow drops of sleep. Now on the shore, Eurylochus made his insidious plea. "Comrades," he said, "you've gone through everything. Listen to what I say. All deaths are hateful to us mortal wretches, but famine is the most pitiful, the worst end that a man can come to. Will you fight it? Come, we'll cut out the noblest of these cattle for sacrifice to the gods who own the sky. And once at home in the old country of Ithaca, if ever that day comes, we'll build a costly temple and adorn it with every beauty for the Lord of Noon. But if he flares up over his heifers lost, wishing our ship destroyed, and if the gods make cause with him, why, Then I say, better open your lungs to a big sea once for all than waste to skin and bones on a lonely island. Thus Eurylochus. And they murmured, Aye, trooping away at once to round up heifers. Now that day tranquil cattle with broad brows were grazing near, and soon the men drew up around their chosen beasts in ceremony. They plucked the leaves that shone on a tall oak, having no barley meal, to strew the victims, performed the prayers and ritual, knifed the kine and flayed each carcass,
1078.
cutting thigh bones free to wrap in double folds of fat. These offerings, with strips of meat, were laid upon the fire. Then, as they had no wine, they made libation with clear spring water, broiling the entrails first. And when the bones were burnt and tripes shared, they spitted the carved meat. Just then my slumber left me in a rush. My eyes opened, and I went down the seaward path. No sooner had I caught sight of our black hull than savory odors of burnt fat eddied around me. Grief took hold of me, and I cried aloud, O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, you made me sleep away this day of mischief. O cruel drowsing in the evil hour. Here they sat, and a great work they contrived. Lampetia, in her long gown meanwhile, had borne swift word to the overlord of noon. They have killed your kind. And the Lord Helios burst into angry speech amid the immortals. O Father Zeus and gods in bliss forever, punish Odysseus's men. So overweening now they have killed my peaceful kine, my joy at morning when I climbed the sky of stars, and evening when I bore westward from heaven. Restitution or penalty they shall pay, and pay in full, or I go down forever to light the dead men in the underworld. Then Zeus, who drives the storm cloud, made reply. Peace, Helios. Shine on among the gods. Shine over mortals in the fields of grain. Let me throw down one white-hot bolt and make splinters of their ship in the wine-dark sea. Calypso later told me of this exchange, as she declared that Hermes had told her. Well, when I reached the sea cave in the ship, I faced each man and had it out. But where could any remedy be found? There was none. The silken beeves of Helios were dead. The gods, moreover, made queer signs appear. Cowhides began to crawl, and beef, both raw and roasted, lowed like kine upon the spits. Now 6 full days my gallant crew could feast upon the prime beef they had marked for slaughter from Helios's herd, and Zeus, the son of Cronus, added one fine morning. All the gales had ceased, blown up, and with an offshore breeze we launched again, stepping the mast and sail to make for the open sea. Astern of us the island coastline faded, and no land showed anywhere, but only sea and heaven. When Zeus Cronion piled a thunderhead above the ship while gloom spread on the ocean. We held our course, but briefly.
181.
Then the squall struck whining from the west, with gale force, breaking both forestays, and the mast came toppling aft along the ship's length, so the running rigging showered into the bilge. On the afterdeck, the mast had hit the steersman a slant blow, bashing the skull in, knocking him overside, as the brave soul fled the body like a diver. With crack on crack of thunder, Zeus let fly a bolt against the ship, a direct hit, so that she bucked in reeking fumes of sulfur, and all the men were flung into the sea. They came up round the wreck, bobbing a while like petrels on the waves. No more seafaring homeward for these, no sweet day of return. The god had turned his face from them. I clambered fore and aft my hulk until a comber split her keel from ribs, and the big timber floated free. The mast, too, broke away. A backstay floated dangling from it, stout rawhide rope, and I used this for lashing mast and keel together. These I straddled, riding the frightful storm. Nor had I yet seen the worst of it, for now the west wind dropped and a southeast gale came on. One more twist of the knife, taking me north again, straight for Charybdis. All that night I drifted, and in the sunrise, sure enough, I lay off Scylla Mountain and Charybdis Deep. There, as the whirlpool drank the tide, a billow tossed me, and I sprang for the great fig tree, catching on like a bat under a bough. Nowhere had I to stand, no way of climbing, the root and bole being far below, and far above my head the branches and their leaves massed, overshadowing Charybdis pool. But I clung grimly, thinking my mast and keel would come back to the surface when she spouted. And
Top of
how
1082.
long, with what desire I waited, till at the twilight hour, when one who hears and judges pleas in the marketplace all day between contentious men goes home to supper, the long poles at last reared from the sea. Now I let go with hands and feet, plunging straight into the foam beside the timbers, pulled astride, and rowed hard with my hands to pass by Scylla. Never could I have passed her, had not the Father of gods and men this time kept me from her eyes. Once through the strait, 9 days I drifted in the open sea before I made shore, buoyed up by the gods upon Ogygia Isle. The dangerous nymph Calypso lives and sings there in her beauty, and she received me, loved me. But why tell the same tale that I told last night in hall to you and to your lady? Those adventures made a long evening, and I do not hold with tiresome repetition of a story.
Odysseus, the great storyteller, will end this story and this whole section of the Odyssey by saying, I'm done now with my story. And of course, he will then lead to the, do you think, Alcyoneus, that the Phaeacians can help me to get home? Let's look now at this passage for just a moment, and let's try and make some understanding views at level 1, 2, and 3. Quickly at level 1. Well, he says it. We ended up on the island of Helios, and I told my men, whatever you do, don't eat the cattle. You're going to get hungry, but avoid the temptation. And it works for a while, but after a while, we're told they got hungry. And then once they got hungry, Odysseus says, I decided I'd go off and pray to the god for help. Of course, while I'm away from my men and I'm praying, he said, I went to sleep. And because I went to sleep, the men decided, notice it's going to be Euryclus who will do it, right? Euryclus will say, hey, let's kill the cattle. It's better to gamble and at least have something to eat now than worry about those gods messing with us later, because we're going to die of starvation anyway. They eat the cows. Odysseus wakes. He recognizes that he went to sleep and therefore he didn't have any sense of time. When he wakes up, something terrible has happened. Odysseus knows it. And in fact, of course, all of his men will in fact drown, right? Zeus will decide that in fact there will be payment, right? Notice on page 1077 that Euryclus will say, hey, will we fight it, right? Come, we'll cut out the noblest of these cattle, and once at home, we'll apologize. That is to say, it's better to just do it and apologize later than to ask for permission and not get it. And so peer pressure works, right? And because peer pressure works, well, we got issues. By the way, let's think about this for just a moment. In the Iliad, we will have a story where Zeus is put to sleep by Hera, and a whole lot of the terrible things that happen in the war happen while Zeus is then asleep. So this is one of those old motifs that you're familiar with at 3A, right? The idea that somebody goes to sleep and then, you don't have the ability to kind of keep the bad things from happening. By the way, on page 1078, just to point it out, you've got some real places and imaginary events in the Odyssey, and they give you a little map here that you may want to pay attention and study as you're kind of taking a look. By the way, just notice on that map where Troy is. Do you see it? All the way to the far right there, where Troy is in present-day Turkey, all right? And then can you see where Ithaca is on the other side? So in other words, Odysseus left from Troy, and he sailed towards Ithaca, but this body of water, often referred to as the Aegean, see, right, okay? And by the way, you can see where the cattle of the sun god will be, there on present-day Sicily, okay? You can see how far it is he has to sail to try and get from Troy back to Ithaca, especially because Zeus keeps sending storms. Well, speaking of storms, notice on page 1081, Zeus will send a storm, right? And that storm will lead then to the death of all the men. And Odysseus, for 9 days, we're told, will float along, right, on a piece of wood. And finally, he will end up coming towards the island of Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis. He has to grab hold of a fig tree and stay there hanging for the rock climbers in the house. You can appreciate this maybe, right? Where, for example, you're climbing. I had a student once who went up into the canyon and rock climbed, got about 40 feet off the floor, and his rope broke. And there he was, hanging all by himself on the rock face, right? And of course the question is, well, okay, what do we do? Because that's too far to just fall and let somebody catch you, right? And so the people down below said, just hang on, whatever you do. Later, that student said, I was reminded of that scene in the Odyssey when Odysseus is above Charybdis, that terrible whirlpool, and he's just grabbing hold of the fig tree, and he cannot let go until he sees the wood come back up out of the whirlpool. And so he has to hang there for most of the day, right? In other words, you can kind of see this as a symbol of a kind, right? Where you're like, okay, if I let go, I'm dead. If I hold on, I'm alive at least for a little bit, and I'm waiting for some kind of help, right? Well, that's exactly what happens. He drops down. He ends up for 9 days then before he finally arrives on the island of Calypso, where he then will stay for quite some time. All right, let's jump quickly to level 2A, and let's talk messages, themes. Well, we mentioned it at the beginning. Let's say it again. The Odyssey in the flashback stories serves as adventure stories, no question, right? These are adventure stories. Like when you make a movie of the Odyssey, these are the best stories, right, that come to mind. But all of these stories also serve as somehow symbolic. They're all, think of it, a form of temptation. Yes? Distractions. Things that try to somehow keep you from being able to stay focused and do the thing you want to do. In 303, we of course call this monkey mind, don't we, right? In other words, we have a tendency to easily forget. The men in the story knew they weren't supposed to eat the meat, but they were hungry. And so they forgot how serious a crime it was to eat this meat, right? Okay, so we're playing a same kind of game. Of course, let's say this one as well. Sometimes bad things happen when you're not paying attention. Odysseus goes to sleep, and when he wakes up, it's over, it's too late. Odysseus, of course, is saying to Alcyoneus, the king of the Phaeacians, I almost was home. Almost there, and then my men screwed it up. By the way, let's point out, this is a third message. Often, collateral damage. Often it's not you that gets in trouble, but rather your friends or the people that you're with who lead you to get in trouble. Odysseus says, I didn't eat any of the meat. And yet, I ended up jacked on the island of Calypso. A final message, of course, is Odysseus holding on to that fig tree, no question. Sometimes in life, the only thing you can do is hold on, right? Hope that you are not going to fall. Just hold on and wait for help, or wait for an opportunity to escape. Sometimes the only thing you can do is hold on, right? In the same way that sometimes when life gets kind of rough, the only thing you can do is go through, right? Get onto the other side. At level 2B, well, obviously our symbolism here, I mean, you can jot down for you. What do you think these cows symbolize, right? The thing you're not supposed to mess with, but you're tempted to mess with, right? As freshmen, of course, we are in high school now, all kinds of suggestions, right? Think about how in our story, Euryculus will give advice, and the rest of the sailors will say, yeah, that's what we'll do. Notice none of Odysseus' men stood up and said, stupid idea, even if we're hungry. Being hungry is better than being dead. Right? Notice nobody did that. Why? Well, that peer pressure, of course, is there. Correct? And he didn't, and nobody stood up to say anything. The irony, of course, then of that is that Euryculus gives the advice, hey, it's better to be hungry, to be filled, and our bellies to be filled, than, to be starving to death. Well, no, there's not. There's a worse option, and that is, of course, the one that you chose. You're going to end up drowning on the sea, right? Okay. So the ironies obviously are there as well. At level 3A, what are the texts for you that come to mind that teach this very idea that you have to be focused? You cannot allow for your desires to get in the way of what you know is best for you. Do you have a song that teaches you that? Do you have a film that teaches that? Do you have a video game that teaches you such a thing? By the way, do you have a text that says, you got to be careful about people giving you advice? Because sometimes people will give you advice and it sounds intelligent, but you know it's not. And you know that you probably are going to end up jacked because of it. What about this? Are you familiar with a text where you end up having a punishment on you, not because of something you did, but for something somebody else did? Let's jump to 3B. What is a time in your life when that happened to you? When was the last time that you were punished for something you did not do? It wasn't your fault, but you ended up getting punished anyway. This is the way the world is, right? Sometimes it isn't your fault, and yet you get jacked. For Odysseus, he will say, I had a long homecoming. It took me a long time to get home because I ended up on the island of Calypso. And the reason I ended up on the island of Calypso is all my men died. And the reason they died is they wouldn't listen to me. Of course, that's another interesting question. We tell the story of Daedalus Icarus, don't we? When the father tells the son Icarus, don't fly too close to the sun with those wings, and the boy didn't listen very closely. The Odyssey plays this game over and over. When was the last time that you didn't listen to the Odysseus in your life and you ate the cows? We're not speaking literally, we're speaking metaphorically. When was the last time that you disavowed or you didn't listen